I never thought I'd tell you this story, Sarah. For 37 years, I've carried it like a stone in my chest, feeling its weight with every breath, every sleepless night, every time I looked into your mother's disappointed eyes and couldn't explain why I'd thrown everything away. You were only 6 when they discharged me, too young to understand why your father came home different, why he stopped wearing his badge, why we moved from that comfortable suburban house to this cabin at the edge of nowhere. You grew up thinking I was a failure, a paranoid recluse who chose maps and conspiracy theories over family dinners and school plays. Maybe you were right to be angry. Maybe you still are. But now, with what little time I have left, I need you to understand that I didn't lose my mind back in '83. I found something that shattered everything I believed about the natural order of this world. And once you see what I saw, once you know what I know, you can never unknow it. The briefcase is under my bed. The lock. Combination is your birthday. Inside are the interrogation notes I was ordered to destroy, the evidence I smuggled out the night I ended my career. Read them after I'm gone. They'll tell you what happened in that facility beneath the forest floor, what I was forced to confront in those fluorescent-lit rooms where science met something older than civilization itself. They called it a special assignment, a matter of national security, requiring my particular expertise in psychological profiling and witness interrogation. I'd built my reputation on extracting truth from people who'd mastered the art of deception, on reading the micro-expressions that betrayed hidden knowledge, on understanding the grammar of lies. The deputy director himself called me at 3 in the morning, his voice strained with something I'd never heard from him before. Not fear exactly, but an uncertainty that seemed to crack the foundation of his authority. He told me to pack for 2 weeks, to tell my family nothing, to catch a military transport, leaving Andrews Air Force Base before dawn. I remember kissing you goodbye while you slept, touching your small hand where it rested on the blanket, wondering why my chest felt so tight with premonition. The flight west was silent, except for engine noise and the whispered conversations of men in unmarked uniforms who wouldn't meet my eyes. We landed at a private airstrip surrounded by old-growth timber, where the trees stood like cathedral pillars in the morning mist. And I was driven for hours along logging roads that gradually disappeared into territory no map acknowledged. The facility entrance looked like nothing, a maintenance shed beside a creek, but beneath it descended levels of concrete and steel that felt like descending into the Earth's cold machinery. They briefed me in a windowless conference room that smelled of burnt coffee and anxiety, showing me photographs I couldn't properly process at first, because my rational mind kept rejecting what my eyes reported. Something had been captured, something massive and bipedal, covered in dark hair matted with blood and forest debris, its face a disturbing fusion of human and animal features that shouldn't exist according to every taxonomy I'd ever studied. The forestry workers who'd found it tangled in avalanche debris had called it in as a bear attack survivor, before realizing what they were actually looking at, before their radios were confiscated and their memories were bound by classification orders that would follow them to their graves. The lead scientist, a woman whose credentials covered 2 pages, but whose hands trembled when she held her clipboard, told me the creature had been sedated and restrained, that it showed signs of sophisticated intelligence, that it had already attempted communication through gestures they couldn't interpret. My job was simple, they said. Make it talk. Learn if there were others. Discover what it knew about the vast wilderness it came from. I nodded professionally, maintaining the composed demeanor that had defined my career, while something ancient in my gut whispered that I was about to step across a threshold from which no return was possible. They led me down through security doors that hissed pneumatically, past observation rooms filled with recording equipment and tense personnel, into the sterile cold of the containment level where the air tasted metallic and recycled. The holding cell was designed like something between a medical bay and a cage, all white tile and reinforced glass and restraint apparatus that seemed obscene in its industrial precision. And there, shackled and bleeding from wounds, the veterinary staff couldn't properly treat because they had no frame of reference for its physiology, sat something that shouldn't exist. It raised its head as I entered, and our eyes met across that clinical space. What I saw in that gaze wasn't animal cunning or primitive fear, but a vast, weary intelligence that seemed to look through me, past my credentials and my purpose, straight into the small, frightened creature I'd been as a child. In that moment, everything I thought I understood about the hierarchy of consciousness collapsed. This wasn't a specimen to be interrogated. This was a meeting between two aware beings, and somehow, terrifyingly, I suspected it understood far more about me than I could ever extract from it. I pulled a metal chair across the tile floor, the scrape of it echoing in that underground chamber like a violation of sacred silence, and sat down, just beyond the creature's reach, though the restraints made that calculation seem absurd and cruel. Up close, the sheer physicality was overwhelming. It must have stood 8 feet tall, its shoulders broader than any human frame could support, muscles moving beneath that dark hair with an anatomy that was simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. The wounds along its ribs seeped a blood darker than ours, and I could see where the tranquilizer darts had left angry welts across its chest. But what struck me most profoundly wasn't the physical presence. It was the way it watched me with a patience that felt geological, as if it existed on a timeline where my entire species was just a brief disturbance in the long dream of forests. I'd interrogated murderers who could hold eye contact without flinching, psychopaths who'd learned to mirror human emotion with perfect precision. But this was different. This was being seen by something whose consciousness operated on frequencies I had no instrument to measure. It made a sound then, low in its chest, not aggressive but almost conversational, a rumbling vocalization that I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. I opened the folder they'd given me and spread out paper and charcoal pencils on the small table between us, the gesture feeling simultaneously professional and absurd, like trying to interview thunder or negotiate with an earthquake. The creature's eyes followed my movements with an attention that was absolutely focused, yet somehow distant, as if it were simultaneously present in this sterile cell and somewhere far beyond it, connected to something I couldn't perceive. When I pushed the paper toward it slowly, non-threateningly, it looked down at the materials with what I can only describe as profound sadness, the way you might regard a child's toy that reminded you of an unbearable loss. For several minutes it didn't move, and I became aware of my own breathing, the fluorescent hum overhead, the scratch of pens. From the observation room where others watched through one-way glass and recorded every moment. Then, with a deliberateness that made my throat tighten, it extended one massive hand, the restraints clanking with the movement, and picked up the charcoal with a delicacy that contradicted everything about its size and strength. The fingers, I noticed, with a scholar's detached horror, had proportions almost human, nails thick and worn from digging or climbing, calluses that spoke of a lifetime navigating terrain that would kill most men. It began to draw, not with the hesitant exploration of an animal discovering a new stimulus, but with the assured strokes of someone who had done this before, who understood symbolic representation, who had something specific to communicate. The first image emerged in bold, sweeping lines, a mountain range I recognized immediately as the Cascades, rendered with a topographical accuracy that suggested intimate knowledge of every ridge and valley. Within the peaks, it drew symbols I didn't recognize, circular patterns that might have been habitation sites or territorial markers, connected by lines that could represent paths or relationships, or something my cultural framework had no context to interpret. Then it drew figures, upright and massive like itself, scattered across the wilderness in small clusters, always away from the valleys where Human settlements appeared as aggressive geometric scars. It worked in complete silence, except for the whisper of charcoal on paper, and I found myself leaning forward, forgetting protocol, forgetting the cameras and the career implications, watching as it constructed what could only be described as a map of coexistence, their world layered, invisibly over ours, occupying the spaces we'd abandoned or never managed to conquer. When it finished, it set down the charcoal and looked at me again, and this time I understood the expression in those deep-set eyes beneath that pronounced brow. It wasn't asking for mercy or offering information for exchange. It was showing me something humans had forgotten we'd once known, a truth about the wilderness being inhabited by awareness, by cultures and territories and deliberate choice. We hadn't failed to find them because they were rare or extinct. They had been avoiding us, withdrawing deeper as we spread wider, maintaining a boundary we were too arrogant to realize existed. I reached for the drawing, my hand trembling slightly, and as I did, the creature extended its own hand again, not threateningly but with what seemed like intentional purpose, letting its thick fingers rest just inches from mine on the table's cold surface. The scientists in the observation room were probably screaming into their headsets, warning me about contamination or danger, but I couldn't hear them through the blood rushing in my ears, couldn't think past the sudden certainty that this gesture meant something crucial, that some threshold of understanding required this contact. Against every regulation I'd ever followed, against the survival instinct that had kept me alive through 2 decades. Of dangerous work, I moved my hand those final inches and let my fingers touch its palm. The sensation was electric and immediate, rough skin, tremendous warmth, the pulse of a heartbeat powerful enough to feel through that brief connection. But then, something else happened, something I still don't have adequate language to describe. A cascade of images that weren't quite visions and weren't quite memories, but felt like both simultaneously. I saw forests as they existed before agriculture, before cities, before human consciousness learned to separate itself from the breathing world. I saw extinctions rolling through time like dark waves, species blinking out as the climate shifted and shifted again, and somehow I understood this creature's kind had witnessed it all, remembering what we'd never learned. And then, impossibly, I saw myself as a child of 7, camping with my father in woods I'd forgotten, waking in the night to see something massive standing at the tree line, watching our tent with eyes that reflected the firelight before turning and vanishing into darkness, so complete it seemed like the forest had simply absorbed it back into itself. I pulled my hand back, as if I'd touched flame, the contact breaking with a sensation like tearing through cobwebs, and the underground chamber snapped back into focus with its harsh fluorescent lighting and antiseptic smell that couldn't quite mask the musk of wild animal and fear sweat. The creature didn't react to my withdrawal, simply closed its massive hand and returned it to its lap with that same unsettling grace, those dark eyes never leaving my face, as if monitoring how I processed what had just occurred. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel sweat cooling on my forehead despite the climate-controlled air, my mind scrambling for rational explanations, contact high from stress, suggestion brought on by the strangeness of the situation, some neurological trick produced by whatever pheromones or infrasound the creature might be generating. But even as I constructed these fragile scaffolds of scientific reasoning, I knew with a certainty that lived in my bones rather than my brain, that what I'd experienced was real, that this being had somehow opened a door in my consciousness and shown me things that existed beyond the narrow bandwidth of ordinary human perception. In the observation room, I could see Collins gesturing frantically at someone off camera, probably demanding medical evaluation or questioning whether I'd been compromised. But their concern felt distant and almost comical. Men in suits worried about protocol while sitting in the presence of something that redefined every assumption we'd built our civilization upon. The creature made that low rumbling sound again, and this time I recognized it not as aggression or distress, but as something closer to acknowledgement, the way you might speak softly to someone who'd just woken from a profound dream, orienting them back to the waking world. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to reclaim some semblance of professional composure, and turned my attention back to the drawing on the table between us, though my hands still trembled slightly as I pulled it closer. The level of detail was extraordinary. Individual peaks rendered with topographical precision, watersheds and river systems traced with the accuracy of someone who'd traveled every mile on foot, who knew the land not as abstraction on a map, but as living territory. The symbols marking what I assumed were habitation sites followed patterns that made intuitive sense once I stopped trying to interpret them through human logic. Concentrated in the most remote areas, the highest elevations, the deepest forest where logging hadn't yet penetrated, always positioned with what seemed like strategic sightlines to valleys below. It was a defensive map, I realized with growing unease, a record of strategic withdrawal spanning decades or maybe centuries, each marker representing a deliberate choice to retreat rather than confront, to preserve invisibility at the cost of ever-shrinking territory. The human settlements appeared almost as afterthoughts in the drawing, crude squares and rectangles clustered in lowlands and along transportation corridors. But even rendered in simple geometry, they radiated a kind of aggressive expansion, tendrils reaching into wilderness like infection, spreading through healthy tissue. What struck me most profoundly was that this wasn't the work of an animal marking territory through instinct. This was cartography, strategic thinking, cultural knowledge passed down and updated across generations. This was evidence of a society. I looked up from the paper to find the creature watching me with an intensity that made me understand it was gauging my comprehension, measuring whether I grasped not just the information but its implications. Without thinking, I asked, "How many?" and immediately felt foolish speaking aloud to something that clearly couldn't respond in English. But the creature's eyes narrowed slightly, as if parsing my intent, if not my words. It reached for another sheet of paper with movements made awkward by the restraints, and I felt a surge of anger at whoever had ordered those chains, at the reduction of conscious being to specimen, at my own complicity in this sterile violence. The creature drew quickly this time, simple figures, humanoid but massive, scattered across a rough outline of the Pacific Northwest, each figure isolated or in pairs, never in large groups. It drew perhaps 30, maybe 40 individuals across hundreds of miles of wilderness, then set down the charcoal and touched the paper with one thick finger, pressing down with enough force to tear slightly. The gesture's meaning was unmistakable. This was all that remained, this scattered handful clinging to the margins of a world that had no room left for mysteries, for things that existed outside human dominion and documentation. I felt something crack open in my chest, a grief I had no right to claim but couldn't prevent, mourning for a loss I'd only just learned existed. The creature shifted its weight, chains rattling against the restraint points bolted into the concrete floor, and I saw it wince as the movement pulled against wounds that weren't receiving anything close to adequate medical care. It made a different sound then, higher and more complex, a vocalization that rose and fell with patterns that felt linguistic, and I found myself leaning closer despite knowing I couldn't understand, straining to catch meaning in those alien phonemes. The sound filled the small chamber, resonating off tile and steel, and I realized with a start that it was beautiful. Not in any human musical sense, but with the organic complexity of birdsong or whale call, communication shaped by a vocal anatomy and cultural context entirely separate from our own evolutionary path. As I listened, I became aware that my eyes were burning, that tears were tracking down my face without my permission, my body responding to something my rational mind couldn't process. The creature fell silent, and we sat in that charged quiet, two conscious beings separated by language and species and the vast gulf of misunderstanding, yet connected by the simple fact of recognition. I saw it as aware, and it saw that I saw, and that mutual acknowledgement changed something fundamental that I knew I could never undo. The sessions developed a rhythm over the following days, a kind of proto-language built from necessity and something deeper, a mutual hunger to bridge the unbridgeable. I would arrive each morning to find the creature alert and waiting, those dark eyes tracking my entrance with what I'd come to recognize as anticipation rather than wariness. And I'd begun bringing materials beyond the standard interrogation tools. Colored pencils, larger sheets of paper, even a worn atlas from the facility library that I'd smuggled past Colin's increasingly suspicious scrutiny. The creature's hands, so massive they could crush bone with casual pressure, manipulated these objects with remarkable delicacy, selecting colors with deliberate purpose, tracing geographical features with the care of a master craftsman. We'd spend hours in communication that existed somewhere between artistic collaboration and archaeological excavation, each drawing revealing layers of knowledge that predated written history, indigenous prophecies rendered in symbols that matched patterns I'd seen in anthropology texts, but couldn't fully decipher. The creature would pause sometimes, tilting its head as if listening to voices I couldn't hear, then return to the paper with renewed purpose, adding details that transformed simple maps into narratives of ecological memory, warnings encoded in imagery that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to something primal in my understanding. What emerged from these sessions wasn't just information, but cosmology, a comprehensive worldview that positioned humanity not as the culmination of natural selection, but as a dangerously disconnected branch, severed from the symbiotic relationships that governed healthy ecosystems. The creature drew forests as living networks, root systems intertwining with fungal colonies and animal migrations in patterns that suggested conscious coordination, and placed its own kind within these systems not as dominant predators but as witnesses, gardeners, something closer to monks than hunters. In one particularly detailed illustration, it depicted what I eventually understood was a timeline stretching back thousands of years, showing its species retreating steadily as human populations expanded, a deliberate withdrawal that suggested not defeat but horrified choice, as if they'd recognized something catastrophic in our trajectory and decided the only survival lay in invisibility. The creature would touch these drawings and vocalize those complex rising and falling calls that I'd started recording on the small cassette player I'd hidden in my briefcase, and though I couldn't translate the sounds, I felt their emotional resonance, grief, warning, something that might have been forgiveness or pity for a younger species that didn't understand what it was destroying in its rush toward progress. I found myself responding in kind, speaking aloud my own observations and questions, knowing it couldn't understand my words, but trusting it could read the intention behind them, and we existed in those hours in a space beyond normal human interaction. Two forms of consciousness, learning to recognize each other across an evolutionary divide. The breakthrough came on the 6th day when I brought photographs from my own life without quite knowing why. Pictures of my daughter as a toddler, my ex-wife before the divorce, a snapshot of the small cabin my grandfather had built in the Adirondacks, where I'd spent childhood summers surrounded by forest and creek song. The creature studied these images with an intensity that felt invasive, intimate, its thick fingers hovering over my daughter's face with something resembling tenderness, and then it began to draw with an urgency I hadn't seen before, creating an image that froze my breath in my lungs. It was me as a child, rendered in rough but unmistakable detail, standing at the edge of a tree line with something massive and shadowed, visible between the trunks behind me. The memory I'd buried for 30 years, the thing I'd convinced myself was childhood imagination, the presence I'd felt watching from the forest darkness during a night I'd wandered too far from my grandfather's cabin. The creature tapped the drawing insistently, then placed its palm flat over the shadowed figure and vocalized a single sound, repeated 3 times, and I understood with absolute certainty that it was claiming responsibility, stating presence, telling me that our connection hadn't begun in this sterile underground chamber, but decades ago in genuine wilderness, that I'd been seen and allowed to return unharmed, that some part of me had always carried that encounter forward, even as my conscious mind rejected its possibility. I reached across the table without thinking, my hand covering the creature's where it rested on the drawing. And this time, I didn't pull away when the visions came. I leaned into them, accepting the gift or burden of expanded perception, as forests blazed through my consciousness with devastating beauty and equally devastating loss. I saw the world as the creature saw it, felt the network of living connection that humans had systematically dismantled, experienced the loneliness of being among the last witnesses to what the world had been before our species' ascendance transformed wonder into resource and mystery into commodity. But beneath the grief I felt something else, a fierce, protective love for what remained, for the scattered survivors clinging to shrinking wilderness, for the possibility that consciousness might persist in forms we'd never recognize if we didn't learn to see beyond our own reflection. When the contact finally broke, I was weeping openly, not in sadness but in recognition, understanding that this creature hadn't been captured by accident, that it had allowed itself to be found, that it was trying to communicate something essential before its kind vanished completely into legend and extinction. The creature made that low rumbling sound again, acknowledgement and benediction, and I knew that whatever happened next, I could never return to the comfortable certainty of human supremacy, could never unknow what I'd been shown about our place in the vast web of conscious life that we'd convinced ourselves existed solely for our use and dominion. The touch lingered in my nervous system long. After the creature withdrew its hand, phantom sensations crackling through neural pathways like electrical storms, rewiring decades of carefully constructed identity. I couldn't sleep that night in my assigned quarters, couldn't reconcile the sterile government cot with the primordial visions still blazing behind my closed eyelids, couldn't unknow the terrible intimacy of having my own buried memory reflected back through non-human consciousness that had somehow carried it forward across 30 years and 1,000 miles. I found myself pressing my palms against the concrete walls as if I could push through to genuine earth, to root systems and fungal networks, to the living world that existed beyond human architecture and classification. What haunted me most wasn't the visions of ancient forests or mass extinctions, but that single childhood moment rendered in the creature's drawing, the recognition that I'd been seen and catalogued and remembered by something that possessed its own system of record-keeping, its own reasons for tracking individual humans through the noise of our sprawling civilization. I'd built my entire career on the assumption that I was the observer, the documenter, the intelligence gatherer, passing information from subjects who existed primarily as sources to be extracted and filed. But that drawing had inverted the hierarchy with devastating simplicity, revealing that I'd been the subject all along, studied and assessed and ultimately chosen for this encounter by awareness that operated according to logic I'd never imagined. The implications spiraled outward like cracks in safety glass, fragmenting every certainty I'd constructed about consciousness, memory, and the fundamental question of which species had been watching which all these centuries, while we congratulated ourselves on our dominion over the natural world. I returned to the chamber before dawn, overriding the night guard's weak protests with credentials and desperation, needing to understand what the creature had shown me, why that specific memory had survived in its knowledge when I'd successfully buried it beneath layers of education and rationalization. The creature was awake, had perhaps been awake all along, and greeted my entrance with that low, resonant call that I'd come to recognize as acknowledgement, welcome, something that might have been its name for me in a language that predated words. I approached the reinforced table without the usual procedural caution, pulled out the drawing of my childhood self, and pointed at the shadowed figure behind the trees with a trembling finger. The creature studied my face rather than the image, reading emotional data with the precision of an MRI scan, then placed both massive palms flat on the table in a gesture I'd learned meant preparation, warning that what came next would be significant. When it reached toward me this time, I didn't hesitate. I grasped its hand with both of mine and consciously opened myself to whatever transmission it needed to send, abandoning the last pretense of professional detachment in favor of raw human hunger to understand the mystery that had haunted my subconscious for 3 decades. The visions came faster now, more controlled, as if the creature had learned to modulate the intensity of its communication through our previous contact. And I saw not just random imagery, but structured narrative, deliberate explanation crafted specifically for my limited perception and translated into symbols my traumatized consciousness could process without completely fracturing. I saw myself at 7 years old, genuinely lost in the Adirondack forest after wandering too far from my grandfather's cabin, chasing what I'd thought was a deer. Night falling with terrifying speed as childhood confidence curdled into animal panic. I saw the moment I'd collapsed beneath a massive hemlock, hypothermia beginning its shutdown sequence, death approaching with the casual inevitability of weather patterns or seasonal change. And then I saw it approach through the darkness, not the vague shadow I'd half remembered, but rendered now in perfect detail. A female of the species, smaller than the male I currently touched, but no less powerful, assessing the dying human child with eyes that held more compassion than my own species typically extended to its young. The vision showed her lifting me with impossible gentleness, carrying my unconscious body through terrain that would have taken search, parties days to navigate, placing me on my grandfather's porch in the hours before dawn and touching my forehead with deliberate tenderness before vanishing back into forest darkness. I watched search dogs arrive at sunrise, saw my grandfather find me, and assume I'd somehow crawled back on my own, witnessed the construction of the false memory I'd carried ever since, that I'd never been truly lost, just momentarily confused, certainly never in actual danger. But the creature's transmission included one additional detail that shattered me completely. The female had been carrying an infant clinging to her back during the rescue, had risked her own offspring's safety to save a human child whose species was already decimating her habitat, had chosen compassion over the survival mathematics that should have governed her decision, had demonstrated a capacity for moral choice that contradicted every assumption embedded in my training about intelligence hierarchies and the exclusive nature of human ethics. The vision released me back into the present moment, where I sat gasping across from a creature I'd been taught to classify as an undiscovered primate, a biological curiosity to be catalogued and controlled, while the truth rewrote itself across every synapse. This was a people, a civilization that had chosen invisibility over dominion, stewardship over exploitation, and had been actively saving us from ourselves for longer than our recorded history could measure. I understood now why the creature had remembered me specifically, why I'd been chosen for this encounter among all the federal agents and intelligence specialists the government could have assigned. I represented a debt being called in after 30 years of interest, a life saved that now owed a reciprocal salvation to the one who'd rescued the rescuer's mother all those decades ago in forest darkness. The weight of that revelation was still crushing my chest when Major Hendricks and his military contingent arrived for what he called a strategic briefing, but what I immediately recognized as an ultimatum They spread satellite imagery across the observation room table, showing vast sections of the Cascade Range, highlighted in red thermal signatures indicating potential den sites and territorial markers. A systematic map of vulnerability that made my stomach turn. Hendricks explained in the bureaucratic monotone of someone who'd performed similar speeches before that. The creature's cooperation in identifying its population centers would determine whether containment remained the primary objective or whether more permanent solutions became necessary. He used words like threat assessment and resource allocation and acceptable losses, while I stared at the maps and saw instead a mother carrying an infant through darkness to save a human child, saw a species that had deliberately removed itself from conflict with an invasive civilization that had already demonstrated its capacity for genocidal efficiency. The other specialists nodded along with professional detachment, already calculating career advancement opportunities and security clearances, while I felt the last foundations of my institutional loyalty crumbling beneath the moral implications of what Hendricks was actually proposing. Through the observation glass, I could see the creature sitting motionless in its restraints, head tilted as if it could hear our conversation through the supposedly soundproof barrier, and I knew with terrible certainty that it understood exactly what was being planned, had probably anticipated this outcome from the moment of its capture, had perhaps even allowed itself to be taken specifically to draw human attention away from the vulnerable populations Hendricks now wanted to map and eliminate. I returned to my quarters and performed the most thorough search for surveillance equipment I'd executed since advanced training at Quantico, finding 3 audio devices and 1 camera that I systematically disabled with techniques that would leave investigators uncertain whether the failure was technical malfunction or deliberate sabotage. In the privacy I'd created, I retrieved the creature's drawings from my locked case and studied them with new comprehension, recognizing now that every symbol and map represented not intelligence to be extracted, but warning being offered, prophecy being shared by awareness that could perceive patterns. My species remained catastrophically blind to despite our technological sophistication. The drawing of forests burning wasn't metaphor but prediction, ecological collapse approaching with mathematical inevitability, while we congratulated ourselves on quarterly profits and gross domestic product. The images of extinct megafauna weren't random but deliberate historical record, evidence that the creatures people had witnessed previous mass extinctions and understood the patterns that preceded them, recognized that humanity was currently replicating behaviors that had previously eliminated entire branches of the evolutionary tree, and the map indicating their territorial boundaries wasn't surrender but final diplomatic overture, one last attempt to negotiate peaceful coexistence with a species that had historically responded to such offers with violence and appropriation. I understood what the creature needed from me now, what debt repayment actually required, and the understanding arrived with such crystalline clarity that I knew I'd probably been guided toward this decision from the moment I'd accepted the assignment. My free will an illusion maintained only until the necessary revelation could take root. The creature's health was deteriorating faster than the facility doctors had predicted, infections spreading through the shoulder wound despite antibiotics that should have been effective against any known pathogen. Its body apparently rejecting medical intervention, the way transplant patients sometimes refused foreign tissue, regardless of biological compatibility. I watched through observation glass as it struggled with breathing that had been effortless days earlier, saw the dimming of awareness in eyes that had contained such devastating intelligence, and recognized the timeline narrowing toward a choice that would define whatever remained of my compromised soul. Hendricks had scheduled the dissection for the following week, regardless of whether the creature survived that long, had already contracted specialists from 3 different agencies who would reduce this ancient awareness to tissue samples and skeletal measurements, would distribute its remains across secure facilities where isolated body parts would be studied by researchers who would never grasp the wholeness of what they'd dismembered. That night, I sat in the observation room, long after the other personnel had retired, and placed my palm against the glass, separating us. And a creature lifted its massive hand to mirror the gesture from its side of the barrier, and in that moment of impossible connection across species and imprisonment and the vast gulf of mutual incomprehension, I made the decision that would cost me everything I'd built across 20 years of government service, would brand me traitor and saboteur, and, worse, would reduce my daughter's father to classified footnote in files that would remain sealed long after both of us had returned to the earth that had briefly shaped us into temporary configurations of consciousness and moral consequence. I requisitioned a late-night session under the pretense of breakthrough progress, forging Major Hendricks's signature on authorization forms with a steadiness that surprised me, given what I was actually planning. The facility had reduced to skeleton crew by 2,300 hours, just 2 guards at the main entrance and 1 technician monitoring life signs from the control room, who I'd convinced to take an extended break with coffee. I'd personally prepared and deliberately over-caffeinated to ensure his bladder would demand attention at the crucial moment. I entered the containment chamber alone for the first time since the initial encounter, the door sealing behind me with pneumatic finality that felt like a coffin closing or perhaps opening, depending on which side of resurrection you stood. The creature watched my approach with eyes that held no surprise, only a profound sadness that seemed to encompass not just its own captivity, but some larger tragedy I was only beginning to comprehend. I set my recorder on the table between us and spoke the words I'd rehearsed, the official questions about population and territory that were expected to appear on tomorrow's transcripts, while my hands moved beneath the table edge to sketch urgent symbols on paper I'd hidden in my jacket, symbols copied from the creature's own drawings that I desperately hoped would communicate the warning. I couldn't speak aloud to surveillance I suspected was still functional, despite my earlier sabotage. The creature's response began as low vocalization that I'd initially classified as threat display, but had come to recognize as something closer to music or perhaps prayer. Harmonic frequencies that resonated in my chest cavity and made my vision blur at the edges. The sound built in complexity and layers, multiple tones emerging from a single throat in ways human vocal anatomy couldn't replicate, and I understood I was hearing language so ancient that it predated human speech itself, communication that bypassed symbolic representation entirely to convey meaning through pure emotional resonance. My recording equipment registered the vocalizations as distorted static, the technology incapable of processing frequencies that my body somehow translated directly into comprehension that bypassed rational interpretation. I felt, rather than heard, what the creature was expressing, visceral knowledge flooding my awareness about the sacred places its people had guarded for millennia, locations where the continental plates met and earthquake energies concentrated, where watersheds began that fed entire regions, where seed banks of extinct plant species had been deliberately preserved against the day when human industrial agriculture would finally collapse under the weight of its own genetic narrowing. These weren't random wilderness territories, but strategically essential zones that its people had been actively protecting from human development, working in shadows to divert logging operations and discourage mining exploration, and subtly influence indigenous communities to maintain traditional land practices that unknowingly served larger ecological preservation. The creature moved to the table despite its restraints and began drawing with desperate urgency. its massive fingers somehow achieving delicate precision as it sketched a new map that made my blood freeze with understanding. The illustration showed the facility's location and a network of lines radiating outward like infection pathways, arrows indicating the pattern that would follow once Hendrix's teams began their systematic hunt through the territories I'd been pressured to help identify. But the creature wasn't showing me military strategy or defensive positions, instead revealing the cascade of ecological consequences that would follow its people's elimination from their stewardship roles. I saw drawn watersheds that would silt and poison without the careful maintenance of beaver dam systems its people had been secretly managing for generations. I saw illustrated fire corridors that would become infernos without the controlled burns its people conducted in careful rotation that human forestry services had never detected. I saw sketched migration routes that would collapse without the predator management its people performed to maintain balance between species. Human conservation biology barely understood. The creature was trying to make me comprehend that its people weren't simply inhabitants of wilderness, but active guardians, performing ecological functions that human science hadn't even recognized needed performing. Invisible infrastructure, holding together systems we'd mistaken for self-regulating when they'd actually required constant intelligent intervention. We'd been too arrogant to notice. Then it did something that transformed everything, reached across the table and placed its palm against my forehead before I could retreat, and I fell through reality into vision that rewrote my understanding of history and humanity's actual place in the continental narrative. I saw through its eyes across centuries, watched European ships arriving while its people retreated deliberately into deeper wilderness, witnessed the systematic genocide of indigenous populations, who'd maintained diplomatic relationships with its species for thousands of years, observed the clear-cutting and strip mining and damming that its people had desperately tried to slow through subtle sabotage that humans attributed to equipment failure and bad luck. I felt the creature's grief as a physical weight, the accumulated sorrow of watching a species with such potential for wisdom instead choose extraction and violence, the exhausting vigilance of protecting humans from consequences of our own actions while remaining forever hidden because history had proven what happened to non-human intelligence that revealed itself to European colonial consciousness. The vision shifted, and I saw my own childhood memory from the creature's perspective, watched my 7-year-old self sleeping in a tent while something massive and invisible stood guard against the cougar that had been circling our campsite, saw my mother wandering delirious with fever toward a cliff edge while those enormous hands gently redirected her path back towards safety. The creature released me, and I collapsed back into my chair, gasping while it drew one final image that made my heart break. With the devastating simplicity of its request, a sketch of itself walking free into forest darkness, and beneath it a single word painstakingly formed in English letters that must have taken days to learn. Please. I returned to my quarters at 0300 hours with the creature's plea burning in my mind like phosphorus, that single word in broken English, more eloquent than any diplomatic negotiation I'd ever witnessed in my entire federal career. The briefcase containing my real notes sat open on the narrow bed, pages documenting truths that would be classified into oblivion or more likely destroyed entirely once Hendrix initiated what he'd started calling the extraction protocol in morning briefings. Bureaucratic language designed to sanitize what we both knew meant vivisection and specimen preservation. My service weapon rested beside those papers, standard issue that I'd carried. For 17 years without ever firing outside qualification ranges, cold metal that represented everything I'd believed about duty and national security and the clarity of following orders from legitimate authority. But legitimate had become a word without meaning in a facility where we'd caged something that had spent centuries protecting us. from our own ignorance, where men with clearances and medals planned to dissect intelligence that predated human civilization because we couldn't tolerate mysteries we didn't control. I sat in that dim room doing calculations that had no right answer, weighing my daughter's college fund against a life that wasn't human but possessed more humanity than anything I'd encountered in government service, measuring my pension and reputation against the certain knowledge that some things mattered more than career trajectory or personal security. The choice felt impossibly large and simultaneously simple, the kind of moral threshold that reveals who you actually are beneath the uniforms and credentials and professional identity you've constructed to avoid precisely this kind of fundamental reckoning. I joined federal service believing in protection and order, convinced that civilization required hard men making difficult decisions to shield the innocent from chaos and violence that lurked beyond society's fragile boundaries. But the creature had inverted that entire framework, revealed that maybe we were the chaos that needed containing, the violence that required monitoring by intelligence far older and wiser than our aggressive adolescent species. Every protocol I'd ever followed suddenly seemed like elaborate justification for control we hadn't earned and didn't deserve, rules designed to protect institutional power rather than actual human welfare or ecological sustainability. I thought about my daughter asking why I'd missed her school performances and birthday celebrations, all those sacrifices justified by serving something larger than personal satisfaction, and recognized with devastating clarity that I'd been serving systems that would categorize and eliminate anything that challenged their authority to categorize and eliminate. The creature hadn't attacked its captors or attempted escape or demonstrated any hostility beyond the initial panic of an intelligent being dragged from its home into fluorescent imprisonment, had instead tried to communicate and educate and warn us about consequences we were too arrogant to consider, and we'd responded with chains and interrogation and plans for systematic extermination, proving exactly why its people had chosen millennia of hiding over any attempt at diplomatic contact with a species that murdered what it couldn't dominate. I understood then that my entire career had been preparation for this single choice, every compromise and postponed ethics discussion leading to this sterile room where I finally had to decide whether duty meant following orders or protecting something infinitely more valuable than bureaucratic hierarchy. The plan formed with startling completeness, as though some part of my mind had been working on contingencies since the first moment I'd looked into those ancient eyes and recognized personhood that made mockery of human exceptionalism. I would need to disable the surveillance system completely rather than temporarily, create a failure that looked like cascading technical malfunction rather than deliberate sabotage that would trigger immediate lockdown. The creature's restraints required biometric authorization that I technically possessed as lead interrogator, access granted precisely so I could adjust positioning for different experimental procedures that I'd been deliberately delaying through falsified reports about cooperation. Progress. The forest beyond the facility stretched for hundreds of miles before reaching the nearest significant human settlement, wilderness dense enough to swallow something that had been evading human detection for centuries before this catastrophic capture. But the guards would notice breach within minutes, and Hendricks would mobilize response teams with authorization to use lethal force against anything attempting to escape federal custody, which meant I wasn't just releasing a prisoner, but guaranteeing my own arrest for treason and destruction of classified assets, and whatever other charges they'd manufacture to ensure I disappeared into federal detention, where inconvenient truths went to die. I packed the real documentation into waterproof cases, wrote a letter to my daughter that explained nothing and everything, and checked my weapon one final time, knowing I wouldn't use it for violence, but might need it for terrible alternatives if the escape failed and capture became inevitable for either of us. I moved through, The facility at 0400, using maintenance corridors that skeleton crews rarely monitored, carrying equipment I'd requisitioned over previous days through separate authorization requests that wouldn't reveal patterns until someone analyzed them retrospectively during the investigation that would inevitably follow. The technical systems proved almost pathetically easy to compromise once I stopped thinking like an agent and started thinking like someone willing to sacrifice everything for principle that couldn't be articulated in any official language or defended through institutional logic. I disabled recording systems through power surge that fried backup drives, created ventilation alerts that diverted the remaining technician to basement levels while I accessed the containment chamber, and finally stood before the creature with bolt cutters and biometric override, knowing this was the threshold moment where theory became irrevocable action. The creature watched me with those impossible eyes that held no triumph or gratitude, but only profound sadness, as though it understood I wasn't saving it but damning myself, trading my entire constructed life for something I couldn't name, except perhaps integrity or recognition that some betrayals of human systems constitute loyalty to larger truths. I cut the restraints and spoke words that felt simultaneously like prayer and confession, told this ancient intelligence that I was sorry for everything my species had done and failed to do, and then together we moved toward the exit and the forest beyond, where I would finally understand what it meant to choose mystery over certainty, wilderness over civilization, and truth over every comfortable lie that had sustained my career. The forest swallowed us within minutes of clearing the facility perimeter, darkness so complete it felt like submersion in black water, and I realized immediately that I wasn't guiding this escape, but following something that moved through wilderness with the confidence of returning home after unimaginable exile. The creature moved silently despite its massive frame, navigating terrain that would have broken my ankles within 100 yards, occasionally pausing to let me catch up with what must have seemed like agonizing human slowness compared to its natural pace. My lungs burned and branches tore at my jacket, and I understood viscerally what it meant to be the protected rather than the protector, dependent entirely on intelligence that owed me nothing after what my species had inflicted during those weeks of captivity. Behind us, I heard the facility alarms finally triggering, distant sirens that meant Hendricks had discovered the breach and mobilized response teams with tracking equipment and authorization that made us both fugitives in eyes of governmental authority. I'd spent 17 years serving without significant question, but the creature showed no panic or acceleration, maintained a steady pace, as though following internal compass toward destination it had always known we'd reach together, leading me deeper into ancient forest, where human laws and federal jurisdiction meant nothing compared to older agreements between land and those who'd learned to walk it without domination. I was beyond exhaustion, operating on reserves I didn't know existed, when the creature finally stopped in a clearing where moonlight penetrated the canopy and transformed everything into silver. Illumination that felt sacred in ways my rational mind couldn't dismiss as mere atmospheric phenomenon. The creature turned to face me fully for the first time since the escape began, and in that clearing it seemed less like the wounded prisoner from the sterile facility and more like what it had always been before human intervention, a living bridge between wilderness and consciousness that existed outside our limited categories. It gestured for me to sit on a fallen log worn smooth by decades of weather, then began drawing in the soil with one massive finger, creating symbols I half recognized from the interrogation sessions, but arranged now in sequences that felt less like communication and more like teaching or perhaps benediction. I watched those deliberate markings taking shape in moonlit earth and felt something shifting in my understanding, recognition that I hadn't rescued this being from dissection, but been rescued myself from a smaller life that mistook control for meaning and institutional authority for Actual wisdom. The creature drew a human figure, then drew a tree, then drew them connected at the roots in ways that suggested relationship our species had forgotten or deliberately severed in pursuit of dominion that isolated us from everything that mattered. It looked at me with those ancient eyes, and I heard again that single word spoken in broken English, home. But understood now it wasn't describing a location, but a state of being we'd abandoned when we chose conquest over participation in the larger community of living systems. The forest around us seemed to pulse with presence, not threatening but aware, witnessing this moment of transmission between species as the creature tried to compress centuries of ecological knowledge into visual language simple enough for my colonized consciousness to process. Then it reached toward me with the same deliberate gentleness it had shown during that first devastating contact in the facility, and I didn't resist as its hand encompassed mine completely, warm and calloused and undeniably real against every comfortable theory about human uniqueness or evolutionary supremacy. The visions came faster this time, less overwhelming but more precise, showing me patterns I'd been too culturally conditioned to recognize, despite existing right at the edge of human perception throughout my entire unexamined life. I saw the creature's people, moving through forests as guardians rather than inhabitants, tending relationships between systems that predated human civilization and would persist long after our aggressive experiment in planetary domination collapsed under its own ecological contradictions. I saw them deliberately avoiding human contact, not from fear, but from profound understanding that our species wasn't ready for relationship that required humility and reciprocity instead of extraction and control. I saw the specific grove they were protecting in these mountains, ancient trees that served functions in planetary climate regulation that our crude science was only beginning to theorize about, living. Infrastructure that couldn't survive industrial logging or resource development that government agencies were already planning for this exact region. And I saw my own daughter inheriting a diminished world where every mystery had been solved through dissection, every wilderness converted to resources, every alternative intelligence eliminated, because we couldn't tolerate anything that refused to submit to human authority. The creature released my hand, and I sat gasping in that clearing, understanding finally why it had allowed itself to be captured, had tried so desperately to communicate with the one interrogator who showed the smallest capacity for transformed awareness. It stood, then with obvious effort, still wounded from the capture and captivity, and gestured toward the darkness beyond the clearing in what I recognized as both dismissal and invitation, offering me a choice about what came next in a situation where I'd believed all agency had been surrendered the moment I cut those restraints. I could return to the facility and face consequences, could claim coercion or mental breakdown, or whatever narrative might preserve some fragment of my former life, could rejoin the human systems that would never forgive my betrayal, but might eventually allow some diminished existence after incarceration and investigation, or I could follow deeper into wilderness that would test every soft survival skill I'd neglected during decades of institutional service, could learn what it meant to live in relationship rather than dominion, could spend whatever years remained understanding what this ancient intelligence had tried so desperately to teach. The creature waited without judgment as I sat in that clearing doing the hardest calculation of my entire life, measuring love for my daughter against recognition that the best gift I could offer her was a world still containing mysteries I'd helped protect rather than destroy. Dawn was approaching through the trees, and behind us the search teams were certainly organizing with technology and determination that made a capture inevitable if I'd chosen the paths they'd expect. But I stood finally, and followed the creature deeper into the sacred darkness, not abandoning my daughter, but trying finally to become the kind of father whose choices might leave her a world worth inheriting, even if she'd spend years hating me for disappearing into wilderness without explanation she could possibly understand. Until reading these notes, I'd somehow find a way to ensure reached her after everything else had ended. I'm reading my father's final entry, dated 16 years after that night in the Cascades, written in handwriting that trembles with the Parkinson's that would take him 2 years later, and his words describe how he spent those years becoming something our language doesn't have proper terminology for anymore. He never returned to civilization in any permanent sense, instead living in the boundary spaces between wilderness and human development, learning to read the forest the way he'd once read case files, understanding finally that intelligence wasn't unique to humans, but expressed differently across species we'd dismissed as primitive because they refused to communicate in ways that centered our assumptions. The creature had led him to others of its kind, a small community living in networks of caves and ancient groves, and they'd accepted his presence not with warmth, but with patient tolerance, allowing him to witness how they moved through wilderness as participants in systems rather than dominators of resources. He writes about learning their communication, not just the vocalizations, but the entire embodied language of relationship with living land, and how that education stripped away every certainty he'd built. His previous life upon, until he was essentially reborn into humility, he hadn't known was possible for someone conditioned by institutional power. And he writes about why they'd allowed contact finally after centuries of deliberate avoidance, because the ecological crisis had reached tipping points where even their careful stewardship couldn't compensate for human destruction, and they needed witnesses willing to translate their knowledge into terms that might reach whatever remnant of wisdom still existed in our legislative systems. My father spent those 16 years trying to protect wilderness areas marked for development, working through environmental organizations as an anonymous donor and information source, feeding them survey data and ecological assessments he obtained through methods his notes don't fully explain. He sabotaged logging equipment, redirected hiking trails away from sensitive groves, purchased land through intermediaries to keep it from resource extraction, living on almost nothing while dedicating everything to preservation of systems most humans never knew existed or mattered. The notes describe frustration and heartbreak as he watched protections fail, watched old growth forests fall to profit margins, watched the climate destabilize in exactly the patterns the creature's people had predicted through their centuries of careful observation. But he also documents small victories, acres saved, watersheds protected, corridors maintained for migration patterns that connected ecosystems across regions in ways that kept larger networks functional despite accelerating pressure. And threaded through all these practical descriptions is his ongoing relationship with the creature, who'd first touched his hand in that sterile facility, meetings in deep forest, where they'd sit together in wordless communication that transcended the crude symbols they'd started with, a friendship formed across species boundaries that had transformed my father's entire understanding of what consciousness meant and who qualified for moral consideration in our ethical frameworks. The final pages describe what the creature showed him 3 weeks before he wrote this last entry, a journey deeper into the mountains than he'd ever traveled, to the specific grove they'd been protecting for longer than human civilization had existed in this region. He describes trees so massive and ancient they seemed like living cathedrals, their root systems interconnected in ways that created communication networks our scientists were only beginning to understand through their limited research into mycorrhizal relationships. The creature's people maintained these groves through practices that looked like ritual, but functioned as sophisticated ecological management, ensuring the tree's survival through climate fluctuations and natural disturbances, protecting knowledge encoded in growth rings and chemical signatures that contained records of planetary changes across millennia. And the creature had shown him evidence that these groves were dying anyway, despite their protection, succumbing to atmospheric changes and temperature shifts that even the most careful stewardship couldn't compensate for anymore, explaining through gesture and shared vision that this was why it had allowed capture and attempted communication, because its people had finally accepted they couldn't preserve these systems alone. My father writes that he understood in that sacred grove why the creature had chosen him specifically for contact, had sensed somehow that he possessed a daughter, had gambled that transformation of one federal agent might eventually reach forward through generation to create an ally positioned to act when he himself no longer could. The briefcase contains more than just notes. I discover as morning light fills my father's hospice room where he died 6 hours ago. There are land deeds to 17 parcels across the Cascades, all transferred to my name through trusts I never knew existed. Strategic properties that create protected corridors between existing wilderness areas. There are contact names. For environmental lawyers and indigenous land councils, people my father worked with anonymously, who are expecting me to continue coordination, he began. And there's a map, drawn in his trembling hand, but overlaid on what I recognize as the creature's symbolic system, showing groves that still survive and development projects that threaten them, a inheritance of purpose that explains why he disappeared and why he spent his final years in obscurity fighting battles most people never knew were happening. I sit holding these documents as nurses move quietly in the hallway. And I understand finally that my father didn't abandon me, but tried to leave me something more valuable than his presence. A calling that might let me participate in preservation of intelligence and wilderness our species desperately needs to survive its own success. Outside the window, the city spreads in every direction, but I'm already planning the drive to those mountains. Already imagining what might be waiting in forests. My father spent 16 years learning to read, already accepting the responsibility he's passed forward through these careful notes and the locked briefcase that contains not just his confession, but his life's true work and my inheritance of purpose. I never expected, but recognize immediately as the most important thing I'll ever be asked to protect. What would you sacrifice to protect a truth the world isn't ready to hear? Subscribe for more stories that blur the line between mystery and revelation.